Canada. It is a country that is no longer true, or north, or strong, or free, or anything else in the Canadian national anthem.
Thank you, Trudeau.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the very first video of my new channel, Alter Arc, an alternate history channel that's dedicated to bringing everyone realistic and entertaining videos. And today, my first scenario will also be the first video of my What If Everything Went Perfect series, inspired by possible history. In this series, I will go over the history of most of the countries of the world and take a look over all their historic blunders and change them in a realistic way in order to create the best possible scenario for that country. In the first episode of the What If Everything Were Perfect series, we will be going over my home country, Canada, home of maple syrup and this idiot. Don't worry, I'll take care of him later. So the point of divergence, or the POD as I like to call it, starts before the American Revolution. The American Revolution was one of the most important canon events in our timeline that gave birth to the US of A. You've probably all heard the story. The British need some extra cash, so they taxed the colonies on tea and a bunch of other stuff, and the colonists were not too happy about that. They decided to throw a friendly tea party in Boston to calmly discuss their displeasure with the British government. One thing led to another, and all the Americans started a revolution, in which the colonies that would end up becoming Canada did not want to take a part of. After that, the British eventually gave up, the British colonists became Americans, and the British loyalists fled to the lower British American colonies, which went on to form Canada, and the 13 colonies went on to form America, and then America went on to become America, and the rest is history. Now Americans, I'm sorry, but none of that is going to happen in our timeline. This is because when the Americans gained their independence, they took 13 of Britain's colonies with them, while also preventing British expansion into more of North America due to their own imperial ambitions. To prevent the American Revolution, what we can do is have Britain meet individually with each of the 13 colonies, rather than the entire coalition, to secure the needs of each of the colonies' individual needs, which can involve playing the colonies against each other to a certain extent to encourage disunity among the 13 colonies, while also granting the colonies more autonomy and no longer taxing them without representation, minus taxes for the naval and land events of the colonies, and a percentage of the profits from trading. And in turn, because the British don't have as much oversight on their colonies because of the newfound autonomy, they would spend far less amounts of money maintaining the colonies, leaving those responsibilities to the colonists, so it ends up being a win-win for everyone. By the end of this, instead of having an independent USA, we now have a newly reformed British America with 13 colonies effectively becoming British dominions. In our timeline, the French went into a ton of debt to help aid the Americans during the Revolution to get back at Britain for winning the 7 Years' War. But in this timeline, since the American Revolution is prevented, France won't fund the American Revolution, which means that they won't end up with as much crippling debt, which leads to the question, does the French Revolution still happen in this timeline? In my opinion, yes, the French Revolution would still definitely happen. All the American Revolution did was simply help spread ideas of liberty more. However, what this does not change is all the debt that France accumulated over all the wars on this graph, and the unrest and poverty because of that, along with the many other problems France faced at the time. The French Revolution would still probably start the same way, with the tennis court oath still happening, because the third estate would still want more power. However, because of the example of the American Revolution not happening, the French wouldn't have an inspiration of the American Revolution to follow, along with more debt and unrest from the war, along with not having American Enlightenment ideals to follow as well. Because of that, the French Revolution would most likely be less radical than in our timeline. However, it would still be a very violent event in French history. This also leads to the next question, which is, does Napoleon still rise to power in this timeline? Since the revolution would be altered because of the American Revolution not taking place, this would mean that there would be different major events and different battles, which would mean Napoleon would most certainly would not be able to rise to power. However, in this timeline, he would still join the military, and most likely the system of soldiers being promoted by merit would still be implemented, meaning there would be opportunities for Napoleon to rise the ranks like in our timeline, which would mean theoretically he could gain power similarly to in our timeline, Now, because this is a what if everything went perfect episode, we will assume for the sake of the scenario that Napoleon finds a way to rise to power in the alternate French Revolution, so that way the Napoleonic Wars can still happen in this alternate timeline. Now, before we continue, I'm going to pull a shameless plug and ask you guys to please like and subscribe to this channel, because this is the very first video that I have made, and I want to get the channel's name out there in the alternate history community. And if you have any friends that like alternate history, then please tell them about the channel. Also, here are some upcoming projects that I'd like to work on in the future. I probably won't release these videos in the exact order, or maybe even scrapping them all altogether if I no longer like those ideas, or if these scenarios just suck overall. I'm planning on putting up this every time I pull a shameless plug for the channel, so that at least you can get something out of it. And now, without further ado, please enjoy the rest of the video. We now fast forward to 1803, right after the Second Coalition War, where we see the first major effects from America now gaining its independence. In our timeline, Napoleon wanted to regain his foothold in North America by regaining his lost colonies, and the first step was purchasing Spanish Louisiana from Spain, who was an ally of Napoleon before he betrayed Spain. All of that would still happen in our timeline. However, since Napoleon's focus was towards the war effort in Europe, which required a lot of money, and it didn't help that he had to pay for a North American colony that was barely even settled. In 1803, he ended up selling this colony to the USA for $15 million, so that he could spend it on the Third Coalition War. This obviously wouldn't happen in our timeline, because the USA doesn't exist. So without anyone to purchase Louisiana, Napoleon will have two choices. Either A, double down on his original plan to expand his empire into North America, or B, pretty much abandon Louisiana for the sake of the war effort. Now, since this scenario is where everything goes perfect for Canada, and I also think this is the option Napoleon would choose, I will pick option B. Although Napoleon won't focus a large part of his military on defending the Louisiana territory, there would definitely still be some resistance from Napoleon to not give up the Louisiana territory so easily. In the Third Coalition War, along with battling against Napoleon in Europe, there will also be a separate front in North America. Despite the capture of the Louisiana territory would be very easy because the British, along with troops from the colonies, would fight some naval battles against France, and then one by one capture port after port, finishing them off with capturing the entrance to the Mississippi River. By capturing those ports, France will lose most of its access to the Louisiana territory, and then Napoleon will have no other choice but to give it up to focus on the main front in Europe. And in the peace treaty, Britain would then add the Louisiana territory as another one of the North American colonies. Later in the Napoleonic Wars, Napoleon betrays Spain and ends up invading their country. As a result, the instability in Spain eventually caused the Spanish colonists to rebel and gain their independence. In this timeline, these rebellions result in the British having another opportunity to gain more land for the future expansion of their colonies. So with permission from Britain, the colonies invade the Mexican and Central American territories that are mostly unpopulated. These newly conquered territories will provide a natural defense against any potentially hostile South American governments that could come to power. After the colonists seize all of the Mexican and Central American territory, along with some Spanish Caribbean islands like Cuba, to gain hegemony over the Caribbean, the British will pretty much have full hegemony over all of North America, which will then have to be consolidated. After the Napoleonic Wars, the biggest winners of it all will be British North America, who have managed to go from having this much territory to this much territory. After this, nationalism from the colonists would be at an all-time high, because the colonists have helped Britain to take over the Louisiana territory and the majority of the Caribbean, along with taking over the Spanish-American territories, mainly by themselves. This ends up creating a separate identity between British North American colonies and Britain, which will end up being the foundations of a new alternate Canadian national identity. From here, the post-war economy of the colonies would be booming, and then slowly but surely, the colonists would begin to move westward with the help from immigrants from Britain, who helped with the westward expansion, along with the British also settling the Mississippi River, similar to how France originally settled the St. Lawrence River. Along with this, the indigenous populations will not be forced out of their homes, which America did in our timeline, and instead we could see regions dedicated to indigenous societies that won't be settled by the colonists, which, although not a perfect solution, it will still be 100 times better than what they got in our timeline, since specific areas will be recognized as indigenous land under British dominion. They won't be subjected to the residential school system like they were in our timeline, and would instead be left alone to their own devices. The colonists would also make a similar deal with the Spanish Americans that would be under British occupation that have historically made with Quebec and with the indigenous peoples in the timeline, which they would have granted autonomy and a right to their culture and language. Although this is a pretty decent deal for the Spanish Americans compared to what many other conquered nations have gotten, most of the Spanish Americans would most likely migrate to other newly independent Spanish countries, so that Britain won't take some of the profits they make through farming, and they can be governed by their own people, and eventually, in most of those territories in the future, would be replaced by mainly English speakers. Along with this, the colonies that ended up becoming Canada in our own timeline would also gain autonomous status like the rest of the colonies. Over the next century, the colonists would continue their expansion westward and southward, while also eventually purchasing Greenland, Iceland, and the Danish West Indies from Denmark. Then over time, the colonies would slowly consolidate into one big dominion, which will be known as the Dominion of Canada, just like in our timeline, but much bigger and powerful. Over the course of the century, the Dominion of Canada's calls for independence will start to become more and more relevant in Canadian politics, which will all cultivate by the time the First World War breaks out in this timeline. By the time the Dominion of Canada enters the First World War, its military would definitely not be as powerful as the USA in our timeline. However, the key difference in this timeline is that the US joined towards the end of World War I, which helped to end the war more quickly. However, just like Canada from our timeline, the Dominion of Canada would join on the side of the Triple Entente because they would still be a colony. In our timeline, World War I was a turning point in Canadian history that truly gave birth to Canada and its national identity, which is explained in a famous quote that I love that says, "Canada entered World War I as a colony and came out a nation." Bruce Hutchinson. The same thing would happen in this timeline. However, the difference is that Canada would actually start out the war as a physical colony and end it as an ally. The war itself would end the same with an Entente victory. However, the main thing that could affect the war the most is continuous Canadian involvement. Canada would play an even bigger role in this war because of its much higher amounts of troops that would be participating in the war, which would mean less to maybe even no conscription in Canada, depending on the population size of Canada during World War I. Whether or not World War I ends early or not is up to debate due to the immense power of the USA, but personally, I believe the war would end earlier than in our timeline due to the sheer amount of Canadian troops being involved. Other than the role of Canada in World War I being much more important, the other main thing would be Canada capturing Alaska from Russia after the Russian Civil War starts, which would already be populated by mostly Canadians because of the gold rush. After the war, there would be an alternative version of the Treaty of Versailles that would end up bringing peace to Europe, which I will cover in a video I plan on making that will cover the version of the Treaty of Versailles that the great powers should have implemented. The most important part of the war is Canadian nationalism. Up to this point, the Dominion of Canada has only participated in a support role for Britain in all the wars up to this point, except for occupying the Spanish-American land. But this is the first time that they would be participating in a major war in a major role that will have a major impact on the war and Canadian society. During the war, Canadian nationalism would be at an all-time high throughout the war, when news of major Canadian victories like Vimy Ridge and other major battles that Canada have won reached news back home. And after World War I ends, major nationalist movements would happen that result in its independence after the war and the Treaty of Versailles. After the Great War, the process of Canada gaining full independence will start to happen, and unlike in our timeline, Canada will develop its full constitution upon gaining independence, instead of waiting until 1982 to sign the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, like in our timeline. And as much as I would love for Canada to become a republic upon independence, realistically, that would not happen because the monarchy was still useful to Canada and popular among the people at the time in our timeline, and will most likely be the same in this timeline. In the end, I estimate that Canada would take roughly a couple years to fully disintegrate from the British Empire and gain full independence. In this new world order that has been created by Britain and France would still be superpowers, just like in our timeline. However, Canada would eventually gain that title too, as it starts to quickly catch up to the military power of Britain and France, due to Canada replacing the USA in this timeline, along with the alternate Treaty of Versailles being created. The post-war war was drastically different compared to our timeline. What this new world order would look like, I will not go over in this video because it's already too long, and I just want to mainly focus on Canada for this video. But maybe if I'm still making YouTube videos in the future, I can make a part 2 focusing on these events in a more global perspective. During what in our timeline was World War II and the Cold War, Canada would develop a military culture similar to the USA, which will eventually succeed Britain and France's militaries, making Canada officially a superpower. Because of this, Canada will start to intervene in more conflicts around the world, with Britain and France bringing peace to the world. They will also establish relations with the South American countries, establishing its own influence through diplomacy and helping some South American countries like Venezuela overthrow their dictatorships, wherever they may be in this alternate timeline. They would even establish an EU-like organization with all the South American countries to expand their economic influence as well. Now, fast forward into the modern day, and Canada has become the most powerful country in the world, succeeding Britain and France, and all the South American countries are now much more stable and wealthy than in our timeline. By now, just like Canada in our timeline, the British monarchy has become much less popular than it originally was, because they don't do anything for Canada anymore, other than taking hundreds of millions of our dollars to pay for their monarchy, and this would be no different in this alternate timeline. After the death of Queen Elizabeth, the Canadians take this event as an excuse to begin preparations to eradicate the British monarchy, transforming Canada into a republic. With that, we overall end this scenario in a very peaceful world, with a multipolar world order that is much less divided than today, which leads the world to peace and prosperity. And as for the quote-unquote Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who definitely doesn't have both liberals and conservatives hating his guts right now, would most realistically never have come even close to have come into power, because he most likely would have never been born due to the amount of population displacement there would be with people who are like colder areas being easily able to move up north, and the people who like warmer climates moving to more southern areas. Just to be safe, we'll just say that the events of Deadpool that happened in Deadpool 1 and 2 actually happened in our timeline, but instead it's just Ryan Reynolds with a really bad case of schizophrenia, who thinks he's a superhero when he's actually just mental and just allows a bunch of random people. But he then eventually gets his hands on time travel, because this alternate version of Canada is just that goated. And then instead of going back in time to chuck a butter knife at a guy who unalived this girl, telling this dude to just walk away, unaliving whatever this is, unaliving his past self who thought Green Lantern was a good movie, and attempting to unalive that one mustache guy before he could grow one. We would instead see him outright unalive Trudeau with a butter knife, and then quickly escape him before the Canadians can shoot him, if there even is anyone who would be willing to unalive him. Just to be safe, we could go back even further in time to tell Justin Trudeau, who was about to walk into the Canadian Parliament for the very first time, to just simply walk away. Just to be even more safe, Ryan Reynolds could go back even further in time to when Justin Trudeau was first drafting his plans to completely ruin Canada before he started politics, and straight up unalive him. Just to be absolutely safe, schizophrenic Ryan Reynolds could then travel back in time to December 25th, 1971, and use maximum effort to unalive baby Justin Trudeau, forever cleaning up the Canadian timeline.